My driver ratings for the 2024 United States Grand Prix. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're having an amazing day. It's time to kick back and relax and watch some driver ratings for the 2024 US Grand Prix. Of course, going through every single driver's performance throughout the weekend. We've had that sprint race and the full race weekend, so there's loads to go through. And of course, we will cover that controversial moment between Max and Lando. Of course, given that the race itself has more bearing on the championship as a whole, there's more points up for grabs, I'm going to bias more towards it, but the sprint race will have some impact in the results for the boys today. So we'll start with the Haas team. We're going in reverse championship order here from last year. Starting with Kevin Magnussen. He qualified in P9, started in P8 because of George Russell starting from the pit lane. That's going to be a theme with most of the drivers in this video. And he finished in 11th place. I'm going to give K-Mag an 8 out of 10 for this race weekend. I think his sprint race was really strong. He did qualify behind Hülkenberg, but he did manage to get in front of him in the sprint. He then came home in P7, got valuable points for the Haas team in their battle with RB. And then in the race itself, he sort of got a bit unlucky. He qualified ahead of Hülkenberg, and then he was put on the 2-stop instead of the 1-stop. And so he had really good pace in the race, and I'm not sure how much of that was down to the strategy being the 2-stop and obviously him working the tyres a bit harder. But ultimately, the 2-stop wasn't the one for the race, and so he dropped back a bit. Had good pace, but couldn't really convert into points. But I think that the 11th place was pretty strong, and of course the points and finishing ahead of Hülkenberg in the sprint was very strong. So Nico Hülkenberg qualified in 12th, started in 11th, and then finished in 8th place. And I'm going to give him a 9 for this race weekend. The only reason that it isn't a 10 is because he did get outperformed by Magnussen in the sprint race and in the qualifying for the main race. But other than that, another great weekend from Hülkenberg, picking up more points for the team. He's looking definitely on course to finish 10th in the championship now, and he is really helping Haas to claim that 6th place off RB. So solid weekend from Hülkenberg. Really good race pace. The 1-stop really did help him out. And yeah, ultimately solid weekend from Haas overall and from Hülkenberg. Moving on to the Sauber team, always the hardest team to rate, unfortunately, because they are so bad. So we'll start with Guan Yu Zhou, qualified in 20th, started in 18th, finished 19th. I'm going to give Zhou a 2 out of 10 for this race weekend. I just feel like it wasn't quite good enough for him. What I will caveat that with is the fact that Bottas was the one that had the upgrades for Sauber this weekend. Zhou did not have them, but I have taken that into consideration, and he was miles off him in the sprint qualifying, which I noticed, like 1.3 seconds or something. In the sprint, he did actually outperformed Bottas. He finished 19th and Bottas finished 20th, but I think Bottas just kind of got stuck behind him a bit. And then in the main race, he had that spin at turn 1, unforced error, which is always going to mark you down a bit. And I think that ultimately he just lost it after that. Like, there was just no pace. I think he ended up being like over 30 seconds off the back. So not a great weekend for Zhou. I think it's going to be one of his last races in Formula 1, which is a bit of a shame. So, on to Valtteri Bottas. He qualified in 18th, started in 16th, and finished in 17th. And I'm going to give Bottas a 7 for this race. I don't know if that's just me being over-exuberant on Bottas, but I think he had a solid weekend. He outperformed Zhou over the whole weekend. It looked for a minute in the first stint of the main race that he was actually going to get not back of the pack. He did finish ahead of Esteban Ocon in that end of the race, but ultimately Ocon had a stinker of a weekend, so we're not talking about him right now. Bottas did make it up to the dizzying heights of P14 at one point in the race. I think ultimately he had far better pace than Zhou, which is unsurprising. But yeah, still just leaving a bit to be desired. I think that Sauber car, as I've mentioned so many times, is just so poor that it's so hard to know. But yeah, is Valtteri doing enough to keep his seat for next year? I'm not too sure, but this race was, I guess, a solid-ish performance. Moving on to the RB team, starting with Liam Lawson, jumping in the car for the first time this weekend, and he had an absolute stunner. He qualified in 15th, but then of course he had all of the engine penalties from Daniel Ricciardo, so he ended up starting the race in 20th and made it all the way up to 9th. And I can't not give the guy a 10 for this race weekend. What a solid performance. I mean, the sprint race left a bit to be desired. He got out-qualified by Tsunoda, and then he didn't really go anywhere but backwards in the race. But to be honest, to just jump in the car for the first time this year and like get points, that is just unbelievable from him. It's similar in a way to the way that Colapinto's jumped into the Williams. But just such an impressive weekend from Lawson. He had all the eyes on him after replacing a massive figure in the sport like Daniel Ricciardo. So the pressure must have been like monumental for him. So for him to come out with points in that race is just such a solid performance. He did benefit in a way from that hard tyre gamble at the start. It seemed like going on the hards from the start, going long, and then pitting towards the end for the mediums was the right strategy for the race. But he still had to manage the tyres and he still had to do it all. And he made some solid moves in the race as well. So yeah, I think deserving of a 10 for this race weekend. And then on the other side of the garage, we've got Yuki Tsunoda, qualified in 11th place, started in 10th and finished in 14th. I'm going to give Tsunoda a 5 out of 10 for this race weekend. I think his sprint race on a whole was pretty solid. He qualified well in that one, but sort of dropped back, didn't really seem to have the pace of the Haas cars to get in the points. In the main race itself, he did manage to gain some positions early. He was in that sort of fight with Gasly, Colapinto, Magnussen. They all sort of went for the two-stop, and of those runners, Tsunoda sort of did the worst. Dropped back behind the rest of them, so not a great weekend for him. He did get that 5-second penalty in the race, and he also spun on his own at turn 1, so maybe the 5 is a bit generous for him, but I do think that his sprint was really solid, so that kind of brings him up. But yeah, getting outperformed by Lawson on his first weekend isn't a good look, but I think that Yuki will bounce back. I expect him to have a good performance next weekend, but this one certainly was one to forget for him. So up next we've got the Williams team. Franco Colapinto to start, who qualified in P17, started in 15th and then finished the race in 10th. And it's another great performance from Franco Colapinto. I'm going to give him a 9 for this race weekend. Another great weekend for Franco Colapinto. Really such a surprise package in that Williams after Logan Sargent doing so poorly before he stepped in. I really am just so amazed at the way that he's taken to this Williams car. He's been outperforming Albon over the last couple of weekends, which is really impressive to see. He was on the sort of hard tyre strategy to start the race and then moved on to the mediums later on, which seemed to be, as I said earlier, the right strategy to be on. He did end up finishing behind Liam Lawson, who started behind him, so that's the only reason that he's getting a 9 rather than a 10. But yeah, he outqualified Albon in the sprint race as well, got into the top 10, which was really impressive. Unfortunately spun on his SQ3 lap, which was a little bit sad for him, but ultimately great weekend for Franco, and he had loads of fans there, which was great to see as well. And then Alexander Albon qualified in 16th, started in 14th and then finished in 16th. I'm going to give him a 3 out of 10. I think that the contact that he had at turn 1 was his fault. He sort of went in a bit too deep and tapped Ocon round. Got damage from that, which kind of affected his entire race weekend after that. So it's a small mistake, but it had massive consequences for him, and it was his fault. So yeah, just not a great weekend for Albon, especially when we are seeing Franco Colapinto doing so well in that car. It kind of makes you worry a bit about what's going to happen with Albon and Sainz in the car next year, because Sainz is performing really amazingly, especially in this weekend. So yeah, tough one for Albon, but I'm going to give him a 3. Okay, onto the Alpine team, starting with Esteban Ocon, who qualified in 13th, started in 12th, and finished in 18th. I'm going to give Ocon a 3. And that might almost seem a bit generous, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because he did get spun round at turn 1, but realistically he was getting outperformed by Gasly for the entire weekend. Like, Gasly qualified in the top 10, Ocon was not there. In the sprint race he got outqualified as well. In the actual sprint race itself, they sort of finished quite close together. But yeah, Ocon just with quite a poor weekend. He ended up taking the fastest lap point off of Franco Colapinto at the end, so I guess you can give him some kudos for that, but it wasn't exactly difficult. He just put the soft tyres on at the end. So yeah, a 3 for Ocon. And then Pierre Gasly, he qualified in 7th, started in 6th, and then finished down in 12th. I'm going to give him, I'm swithering between a 7 or an 8 for him. And to be honest, I'm going to make my decision by the end of talking about it, because it'll make me think about it more. So, He started in 6th. He had an amazing first stint where he was sort of keeping Magnussen behind, keeping him at bay really well, but then he just got undercut massively, so the team sort of stiffed him a bit there, and then he was on the 2 stop, which was slower than the 1 stop, and then he sort of ended up getting into fights that he didn't need to be in. Yeah, and then he got stuck in traffic after changing onto the hards, and then he overtook off track and got a penalty that was definitely his fault. So I think overall, I'm going to give him a 7. I'm going to stick to the 7. Great weekend for Gasly, and it's one of those ones that could have been, but just didn't end up coming to fruition for them. And I think that Alpine really could have done with getting some points this weekend, given that Colapinto got some in that battle with Williams. So yeah, gonna give him a 7. Up next, we've got Aston Martin, starting with Lance Stroll, who qualified in 14th, started in 13th, finished in 15th. I'm going to give Lance a 4 because he wasn't that far off Alonso this weekend, and he did outperform him in the sprint race, but ultimately another lackluster performance from Lance Stroll, and I think, to be honest, a lackluster performance from Aston Martin overall. What has happened to them this year? Kind of a nothing race for both of them. They were sort of in no man's land as the race went on. We may as well get Fernando Alonso out the way as well whilst we're at it. He qualified in 8th, started in 7th, and then finished down in 13th. Sort of had a similar weekend to Gasly actually, but just without the penalty. I'm going to give Alonso a 7 for this weekend. I think that his sprint race was really poor. He kind of got pushed off at the start in the S section and then kind of just fell back from there. Ended up finishing 18th, which just isn't that good. And then in the main race, he qualified really well, but just kind of fell back. The Aston Martin again just seemed to have no pace. So it's kind of hard to rate him. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on him given that he did outperform Lance Stroll, but when your teammate's Lance Stroll, it makes it really hard to rate against because he has massive stinkers sometimes. Okay, moving on to the McLaren Formula 1 team. We'll start with Oscar Piastri, who qualified in 5th, finished in 5th, and I'm going to give him a 5 out of 10 to make it all 5s. Piastri had a rubbish sprint race. He qualified down in 16th, had an absolutely terrible time. It's the type of stuff that you see Sergio Perez doing normally. At least in the main race, he did resurrect it. His qualifying was pretty rubbish, to be honest. He was 6/10 off of Norris in the main qualifying, which just isn't that good. But then in the actual race itself, once Norris sort of dropped back into 4th, he stuck with him for most of the race, especially towards the end when Norris was battling with Verstappen. He kind of got right onto the back of him as well, so they basically finished in the same place. So ultimately, the race itself was okay for Piastri, but everything around it wasn't that good. Kind of disappointing, to be honest. I thought that Piastri was going to be ending the season on a high, but it doesn't really seem like that's going to be the case. So, moving on to Lando Norris. He qualified in 1st. He finished in 4th. I'm going to give him an 8 out of 10. Oh, it's a tough weekend for Lando, isn't it? Because he didn't look that good in sprint qualifying. The car just kind of looked a bit crap in the first corner. I don't know if anyone else was noticing that. And then the actual sprint race, he did really well to get up into 2nd. But then when it came down to the last couple of laps, when all he needed to do was just keep it on the track, he made that lock up into turn 1 and lost the position to Sainz by the end of the lap. So he kind of bottled that. And then in the main race itself, obviously we've got this controversial thing with Max Verstappen to talk about, because that's basically all of Lando's race right there. What do I think, I guess, is the question. To be honest, I think that the penalty was right. I think that Verstappen did really well to defend the way that he did. I just think that Norris needed to be closer to the inside. Every single time with Verstappen, defending the inside is the way to go because he's going to launch it up there no matter what. We saw it at turn 1, lap 1, where Verstappen literally just sent it up the inside. They both went off and through went Charles Leclerc. And then at the end of the race, with the sort of controversial thing, he left the inside open, Verstappen steams up the inside, Norris runs off and gets the penalty. I think that Norris should have let Verstappen back through and gone for it again, but to be honest, even if he did, I think that Verstappen would have kept him behind because he was just defending so well. Norris didn't really seem to have the confidence to properly go for the move. So yeah, I think that ultimately, either way, Verstappen was going to finish 3rd in this race. But Norris, on a whole, he did out-qualify Piastri by a lot, and he did perform better than his teammate. So yeah, I feel like the 8 is fair, but it could have been more for Norris this weekend, and ultimately he needed it to be for the championship. Moving on to the Ferrari team, they had an amazing weekend, didn't they? Starting with Carlos Sainz, he qualified in 3rd, he finished in 2nd. I'm going to give him a 9 out of 10. The only reason that it isn't a 10 is because his teammate finished in front of him in the race. But realistically, Carlos had an amazing weekend, especially the sprint race. His decisive moves on Leclerc were so impressive. And then in the race itself, he seemed to have the similar pace to Leclerc in the second stint. I don't know if they were just managing or not. He sort of got held up behind Verstappen in the first stint. Maybe if he could have got past, then he could have challenged Leclerc for the win. But he did have that issue with the engine that he was talking about on the radio. But realistically, I think that he just about maximised everything for this weekend. If Leclerc did not finish first, then it would have been a 10. So it's going to be a 9 for Carlos Sainz. And then moving on to Charles Leclerc, he qualified in 4th, finished in 1st. I've kind of alluded to it already, but it's going to be a 10 out of 10 for Charles Leclerc. I almost gave him a 9 because Carlos Sainz did finish ahead in the sprint, but I then just kind of thought that that was a bit harsh. Leclerc had an amazing race, just absolutely controlling it from the front. He said in his post-race interviews that he knew that Verstappen and Norris were sort of going to focus too much on each other and take each other off at the first corner, so he knew where to position his car, and you could definitely see that from the way that he approached the corner. And after that, it was literally just race management for him, and he absolutely smashed it. So yeah, can't really not give him a 10. Moving on to the Mercedes team. George Russell started in the pit lane, finished in P6. I'm going to give Russell an 8 out of 10, which I think to some people might be a bit harsh given that he started from the pit lane and finished 6th. But the reason that he started in the pit lane was because he binned it in qualifying. So it's on him that he had to sort of make that heroic drive to come through. Having said that, I think that 6th was about the maximum the Mercedes could have done in this race. Maybe they could have finished ahead of Piastri, but it's a stretch. So Russell did perform really well. To finish in front of Perez coming from that far back was really great. The sprint race, on the other hand, I think that Russell, having qualified in P2, which was an amazing performance, kind of ruined his tyres by fighting a bit too much and then ended up dropping back and basically finishing in the same place as Lewis. So I think an 8 is fair for George Russell overall, but it was a really good weekend from him. And then Lewis Hamilton on the other side of the garage, he qualified in P19, started in 17th, did not finish the race. I'm going to give him a 2 out of 10. Ooh. No, I'm going to give him a 1 out of 10, to be honest. Just a crap weekend for Lewis Hamilton. You do not see him putting in that sort of performance very often at all. I thought about giving him a 2 because of the qualifying in the sprint race, how he was kind of on for being in amongst pole position until Franco Colapinto went off and he had to slow down for the yellow flags. But to be honest, watching the replays back, it sort of just looked like he locked up and made a mistake. So maybe I'm being a bit harsh on him there. But ultimately, binning it on lap 3 of the race is just never what you want to see, especially from a 7-time world champion. He knows that he's better than that. We all know that he's better than that, so he can't get more than a 1 for this weekend. And then finally, the Red Bull team, starting with Sergio Perez, who qualified in 10th, started in 9th, and then finished the race in 7th. I'm going to give Perez a 3 for this weekend. I think that, to be honest, he's just always on the cusp of getting into Q3, and it's just not good enough. Especially considering that Verstappen dominated that sprint race. He just was nowhere, and then in the race itself, finishing behind Russell, who had started in the pit lane, it's just not good enough for him. I'm giving him a 3 over like a 2 or a 1 because at least he didn't bin it like Hamilton. But ultimately, yeah, Perez just not performing well at all. If he's in that car for next year, as I keep saying, I'm going to be very surprised. And moving on to Max Verstappen, he qualified in 2nd, finished the race in 3rd place. And I'm so stuck on the rating for Verstappen. Do I give him a 9 or do I give him a 10? I think I'm going to give Verstappen a 10 because, again, he's outperformed Perez by miles. The sprint race was immaculate from Verstappen. He just outperformed everyone, kept the gap consistent to Norris, kept the tyres in order. I think the race itself was a bit of a weird one because we'd seen Verstappen already dominate that sprint, right? So seeing him in the race kind of dropping back and maybe not being as competitive was a bit strange. But he did have that issue in the first stint that we heard him talking about on the radio. And then he got undercut by Carlos Sainz, and that wasn't really up to him. That was more the team's decision. I guess they were like trying to offset the tyres, but it just didn't really work for them. But yeah, I think that Verstappen does deserve a 10, simply for that defending on Lando Norris. Like, Norris had the better tyres, he had that offset, but the way that Verstappen was just exiting the corner onto long straight every single time, he was taking the same line every single time, and it was just working for him. He kept coming off the corner faster than Norris. Norris didn't really have much of a sniff of getting past him. When he did, he ended up overtaking off track. I just think that it was a great weekend again for Max Verstappen, and it's just what we come to expect from him. So, with all that being said, you can see on the screen right now all of my ratings for this weekend. If you've skipped to this point in the video, please go back and watch all of my explanations on stuff, because, you know, they're somewhat interesting. Anyway, moving on to my stinkiest boy of the weekend. It can be no man other than Lewis Hamilton this weekend. I'm very sorry, Lewis, but he knows himself that was a stinker. Sprint race out-qualified by Russell, main race crashing. You can't not be the stinkiest boy after that. And then my speediest boy of the weekend, I'm going to give it to Liam Lawson, because that is just such a feel-good story. Coming into that car, getting points in your first race weekend. He's just had a great weekend. I'm sorry to Charles Leclerc for it not being him, but ultimately Ferrari did get a 1-2, so the Ferrari clearly had good pace. He still got the 10, of course, and he deserved that, but I'm going to give the speediest boy to Lawson. And so yeah, moving on to the Mexican Grand Prix this weekend. Can't wait for that one. Make sure to watch my preview when it comes out. Get subscribed for that. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to watch this one right here about the Sauber driver choice for next year. Still up in the air. Who knows what's going to happen.